Hey all, can you hear me okay? Yeah, so I'm Jobye. It's my first talk ever in game dev, so this is kind of crazy. Hopefully everyone's not too hungover from the party yesterday, but let's go. So I'll be talking about approaching modular vegetation in games through my work on Shadow of War, which kind of came out back in 2017. And let's dive in. So I'll be broken down into like 3 parts. A bit of an intro first about me, about like the team and like the state of the project when I joined the team. Second part will be just talking about the overall modular approach and why I did that, and then kind of break it down for trees, for gameplay bushes, for ground foliage, and kind of key takeaways from that. And for the conclusion, just rough conclusion and links and Q&A at the end. And along the way, I'll talk a lot about just random pros and cons with any of the methods I'm outlining, just because like no solution's perfect really, and there's always room for improvement. And then also I'll have a bunch of random hot tips as well that kind of stole from Jane Ning from her GDC talk, which was always kind of funny. So yeah, let's dive in. I'm a 9-year games industry veteran. I've mostly worked in AAA. Currently at Respawn Entertainment, working on Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Before that, I was at Monolith for a year and a half, shipping Shadow of War, and then Ubisoft Toronto for 5 years, working on a whole bunch of titles, on open world, single player, linear games as well. So yeah, worked on several titles, and I've kind of like worked on productions back to back essentially, because yeah, the first time I touched the pre-production properly was on Star Wars actually. Before that's been like just production to production, so I kind of approach things like a bit more pragmatically and try to kind of keep the big picture in mind and just knowing it's like, okay, we have that ship date, we gotta like always be shipping. So that's how I approach most things, roughly. And then as for vegetation, I touched that for the first time on Far Cry Primal, so kind of like in the middle of my career. And it was like the first time I touched vegetation like professionally. So we had great kind of like mentoring from our counterparts in UB Montreal. They kind of gave us like a crash course on SpeedTree, on their whole pipeline. So that was like enormously helpful. We got up to speed like really quick. And then after eventually I moved over to Seattle at Shadow of War with Monolith, and I just wanted to carry over a lot of that knowledge there because they wanted to really improve on the vegetation. So the team was a bit of a lie. Like there was no vegetation team really. I was like the only content artist that was dedicated to vegetation in the game. So that was kind of crazy daunting. So I touched everything from like modeling and texturing of them to the technical setup and technical profiling for optimization and all that, and then also propagating it across the world. So I didn't have a team, but I definitely had a lot of support along the way from different departments and like a bunch of different people that I could steal their time away from. So lots of like tech art support, programming support, like concept art support, all that. So big shout out to all these people that helped out in one way or another. Not gonna list all of them. And so who here has played Shadow of War? Like, raise your hands. Cool, like, oh, roughly more than I thought. So a bit of a refresher, and then for those that haven't, this kind of gives you a bit of an overview. One of our trailers that got put out before the end of, before launch. And by proxy shows a lot of the maps I worked on.
To you again, Ranger. How do you answer?
We bring this war to them.
So that came out back in 2017, was a Lord of the Rings video game. So it was a pretty fun project to work on overall. So I joined Monolith Productions back in February 2016, and that was pretty much mid-production. They had started about 6 months before that. And when I joined, they were just wrapping up their vertical slice kind of reveal demo for the game that was going to come out a few months later. So they really only had like one portion of the world that was kind of like arted up and like kind of almost shippable quality. So there was like an initial pass on Vegetation and all that. But everything else was pretty much blank. So like as I said, I was kind of rolling off of Primal back then. So yeah, I just wanted to carry a lot of, over a lot of my Vegetation knowledge and try to adapt it to their workflow and pipeline and engine. So yeah, I had kind of like the crazy mandate of like basically building all of the Vegetation for like 5 of their open worlds in like 12 months, just on my own. So that was, in itself was pretty daunting. And then the team had like a big desire to improve on the Vegetation because their previous game just had like 2 open world maps, and one of them actually had like a bunch of Vegetation. The other was pretty sparse. And then they invested in a lot of tech to kind of help that along in terms of like wind systems and like some like foliage instancing tech. So I'll talk about all that on the way. And so yeah, to give you an idea of where we started. When I joined, most of the maps looked like this. So just all block out. Like there was the beginning of trees that like tech artists had just like kind of pumped out to test the rough pipeline for the Vegetation, but there wasn't too much there. So yeah, and then after we ended up with this at release, so pretty big difference. And yeah, we'll just talk about how we got there. So why the modular approach? The timeline kind of demanded it. Like the 12 months was like kind of crazy, so I just need something that was like flexible and that also that I knew just because I was coming from Far Cry. So I wanted to leverage that and try to adapt it as best as I could to their engine. And so the key difference with that versus like standard Vegetation workflows is that you can kind of see it there with Shadow of Mordor. That's how like their canopy and their leaves were. It's all kind of merged together. You have the branches and leaves together. But like the thing I learned on Far Cry was that on Shadow of War, you just decouple that. So you can have that, you can have your branch and your leaf separate. So that kind of comes with a bunch of benefits. Like some of the key ones is that like it gives you much more texture resolution for your leaves. So like you can imagine that like how small they are there and how big it is there. And then also by proxy, you kind of get a nicer 3D look, which I'll kind of outline how we get there. And it just keeps things flexible, like I said. And I started doing this with trees initially, and then after that kind of like migrated to bushes and then ivy, and just kind of like an overall modular approach and philosophy to everything I was doing. So yeah, this is what Vegetation looked like in the first game back in 2014. This was basically Monolith's first stab at making an open world. So they kept things pretty simple. Like the grass is pretty basic. There's just like kind of one type, maybe some bushes peppered through there. They only had like really one tree type that they just kind of rotated and scaled throughout. It had like a unique big bark, and yeah, things were overly stylized as well too. Like the grass was really thick, the leaves were huge, so they wanted to improve on a lot of that. And then this is what we ended up with on Shadow of War, and like kind of like a similar kind of lush map. Tried to push a lot more of like the tree variety and shapes and sizes. Tried to push for a lot more of the variety in the grass in terms of like composition of what's there, and just kind of pushing stuff to a more kind of realistic sizing in terms of like the thickness of stuff. And this was like our densest map vegetation-wise. So yeah, and then another part of the map, there was this dense forest. And this was like the first time they were making something as dense as this in their engine. So this was like a huge technical challenge. There was a lot of back and forth. Like I had to like profile it constantly on console, making sure this runs okay. Yeah, it was low for a lot of the production, so I had to like constantly be on top of it. And then there was like also the gameplay rub of like if you're on a mount like this or if you're running, you need to be able to run over all the roots that are scattered throughout the forest, because that was a big ask from art direction. So yeah, so then kind of stills from my portfolio, like kind of looking at that intro image again, you can kind of see how like the leaves have kind of, you can see the lining and like the shape breakup. So it's like kind of like the benefits of having that modular approach. You can see it on the ivy here on that same map, in this volcanic region of the world, in this cave region. There's a lot of variety in the maps, the city map. And that's the snow one from the vertical slice that ended up like redoing the trees and polishing up the ground foliage that they made. So yeah, I'll talk about the modular approach, but I'm also just going to talk about the overall process. And like the process usually starts, as with anything in environment art, with reference. So like starting off, like it's good to get really detailed shots of your leaves, your bark, the overall silhouette of the tree, and then also just how it's being distributed in the world, right, and grows. And for the first hot tip, like one thing I found on this project was that it's good to start with a scientific name for when you're Googling. For example, that live oak tree there on the left, like don't search for live oak tree, search for its like Latin name, which is Quercus virginiana. That way you'll get like much more higher res ref. If you're lucky, like you might get like literally leaf scans that some botanist already done, and you could like just reference that for your texture. For that hanging moss from like the dense forest you saw, instead of looking for hanging moss, look for Spanish moss, or if you want to go crazier, that I don't even want to try to say the Latin name for that. And then you kind of take all that, like look for variants of the same thing, especially for trees. So like focus on large, medium, small, dead maybe. And then organize this on like Photoshop and PureRef into like a style sheet. This is kind of just like a slice of one, where this was a eucalyptus tree using that lush map, and kind of use it pretty close. I reference it pretty closely. That was like the first pass that I did. And then just kind of an overview of like what a style sheet would look like. Don't try to read, it's like small text, but like this was kind of like two regions of the same map that are broken down. Like you find your trees, your bushes, your grass, like overall shots, close shots. So then you just reference that along your whole production of your vegetation. And then so step 2 is the trunk texture. I ended up using like a Photoshop, Endo, and ZBrush workflow for this, which was inspired by Steven Oberman over at Sucker Punch with some tweaks. He had like this like really nice image breaking all down the process. And I ended up like not using a Substance workflow for this just because, as I said, I kind of joined mid-production, so I didn't really have time to like ramp up on Substance and like kind of learn that properly in 2-3 months to like be really fast at it. So I kind of stuck to what I knew and like made that really fast. So first step is just getting bark ref. This was like a calibrated texture that our lead had taken, or you can just take something online. Make a tile. It's like, it doesn't have to be PBR friendly at this point. Like you can see there's a lot of dark spots there that are totally out of range. And then from there, you take that, generate a really rough and dirty height map. Like this is not pretty, honestly. It's like, oh, it's almost embarrassing to show, but like, that's the height map you get. And then you take a plane, displace that in a 3D package, and then you use that as a guide for sculpting, really. So you bring it to the sculpting stage, and then you clean it up, and then you pull out the shapes and focus on like a lot of the large and medium details. You don't have to worry about the small details because you can kind of do that in Photoshop. So there's a big difference between what you started there and what you end up with the sculpt after. And then, like I said, micro details, you just focus on doing that really quick in Endo. And this is where you finalize, clean up the diffuse and all that. So yeah, big difference between this and what you started with, and to be PBR friendly and all that. So that was kind of the end result, kind of like in a little marmoset render. And the pros of this is that there's a really quick turnaround for this. So like I was able to pump out like near final bark in like half a day, depending on the complexity. You have really clean height map and normals for blending or tessellation. We ended up even being able to use the tessellation for the PC version of the game, which was great. So yeah, the marmoset thing is not all bullshit. And for cons, personally, I kind of like using a 2-to-1 ratio for trunk textures just because like it requires less tiling because of how vertical trees are. So that way, like you can imagine that like there's like tiling sculpt issues in ZBrush because like it's non-square. So there is some tiling cleanup to do, but that's why I kind of stressed that like doing the style sheet in the beginning because you can kind of get sign off from your lead artist, your art director, and then you're not going to be like wishy-washy in terms of like what you're doing. And where there's room for improvement, obviously, like this workflow would map really well to Substance Designer or Painter, just taking your height map and using that in Designer or your bake in Painter. And then for photogrammetry, you can obviously do that as well if you want to push like really realistic stuff. Just having your 0-1 bark at the bottom and then having it tiled to like a tiled version of that same bark up top. And like SpeedTree 8 actually has like a lot of features to help support that. And then for a hot tip, it's kind of a random one. It's actually something we've been using a lot on Star Wars lately, just for like displacing low poly geo or mid poly geo rather. You just use your height map. So like in here, those roots that you see in the middle there, that's not part of the tree. That's kind of just like a root kit that we can kind of place for gameplay, so you can jump over it and stuff. But honestly, that was just like a simple spline that was displaced with the height map, and it's like super quick, super easy. You can pump out things really quick. And that was the results of it. there was like pretty much between all these 7 barks, plus the other one you saw, that covered like all 5 open worlds. So I just reused a lot and tried to use all those smartly. And then for the leaves, so this is where kind of like the modular approach really comes together, where again here you're kind of trying to work keeping production in mind, and like you don't have to do like a million leaves. You just can kind of just do one really nice one and use that and recolor it and things like that. So here the leaf is high polyed, and again here it's like it's not crazy pretty, nothing. It's like, and the outline isn't even there. You're just making like simple cuts, and again you're just focusing on large details, medium details, not worrying about the small ones, because that can come later. Your outline, you can do that in Photoshop. You don't have to spend time like cutting all that out in your model. So I'm just always trying to keep production and efficiency in mind. And then you bring it all together here. Sorry. So yeah, I opted to use SpeedTree in terms of like breaking down the texture sheets, just because like 3D packages aren't always the greatest with like alphas, unless you're using like V-Ray or whatnot. So you're just basically taking that same leaf that you created, your branch texture, you're creating your branches, you're composing your leaves like that, and then you just bake it out. It makes like really clean alphas and clean normal maps for that. So yeah, it just makes it really quick, and that's why you kind of do your branch at first, because like you can just easily pump this out after. For hot tip number 1, you probably noticed if you've ever done vegetation that the first time you put it in, if you don't have any custom mip maps, like you'll just kind of get that weird dithering as you kind of pull away from trees. So that's due to mip mapping. So like there's 2 ways of fixing that. You can either go into your custom mip map, go into the later ones, and like with a 1 pixel brush just like fill those in, or you can level it out. One thing I found as well is that if you're using like the DDS format, you can actually just turn off mip sharpening and you can kind of get away with it. So for like things like pine needles, which are like kind of sub-pixel big, like definitely useful, because that way like, yeah, it'll hold up well at a distance. You're not going to get any of that dithering and weird pixelization. And then another one is creating blurred edges. It's super important. Something I kind of just took for granted and just did without thinking about when I was on Far Cry, but it really kind of came together for Shadow of War when I was doing it, because I was working on like some grass, and then like I just did like a background color that was kind of roughly matching it, but that doesn't work great because as you're mapping out, that color will bleed into your actual color of your leaves or your grass or whatnot. So it doesn't stay true to like what's on your texture map. So this is one way of doing it. And I actually use a script that I'll be sharing at the end. So yeah, from there, you just take that texture sheet that you had, and you're basically just individually modeling and LODing it. So you can kind of see there, it's like pretty simple models. You try to keep the dead pixels to a minimum and like keep it really low geo. And then as you can imagine, this is what you optimize really in the end. You're not optimizing your whole tree, you're just optimizing the individual elements. From there, you bring all of that into SpeedTree and you form like a kind of a cluster like this. So this is kind of like the big difference between like the standard workflow and this modular approach, where like typically this would have been like one big card kind of just cut up and like subdivided. But here you're kind of like keeping it tighter and keeping it tighter around all the alpha, so it's a bit more optimal. And gives a nice 3D look overall. And then this is your export tree. So you basically bring your clusters in here, and you basically make 1 or 2 variants of them. And then you're just instancing across your tree. So like you're not like placing all these leaves like super uniquely. It's using that same base cluster, and you're just spawning them on your trunk and branches. So for the pros on this, obviously you have like really good texture resolution. You can kind of see it there. Just kind of you get 2 to 3, sometimes 4 times more resolution depending on what you do. You get a nice 3D look from those clusters. And as a bonus too, it reduces overdraw. So like, I kind of did a quick example for the team at the time, where you just have like the standard cards and versus like the clusters. It spreads things out more. Things are cut more tightly around it, so it's a bit more optimal that way. One of the cons though is that it does generate more try count using this method. Like for example, so kind of these 2 examples here. The top one is like kind of like the luscious map that we had in the game. Those actually have to be like some of the most optimal trees. Those were between 7 and 10,000 tries, but because there was so much more density. But then those bottom ones ended up being some of the most expensive ones, just because it was a city map and it was more sparse. So that was like 17K, which is like a lot for a tree. But so that's where there's room for improvement, obviously. For your later LODs, you can kind of bake it down to a more simple card and keep room in your texture sheet for that you just LOD down to. If you want to, and SpeedTree has a lot of like simplify functions that make that really easy. And then also, if you want to push this even further, which is what Ubisoft did, they built like their whole vegetation system around cluster instancing. And that they cover all this in this GDC talk that I link at the end. But they basically just take those clusters and like, that's what you're paying the cost for memory-wise and rendering-wise. And they're actually using the same nodes in SpeedTree to instance them across the tree in game. And then in terms of imposters, for Shadow of War, we just used SpeedTree's compiler ones, which were okay. They were like, you had to do a lot of hand tuning at the end to like make them look decent and work with your trees. So there's definitely a benefit of having like a one-button solution in your engine, which you can kind of just generate, which Far Cry's engine did have and talk about in that GDC talk as well. It's not something I had time to push on Monolith's engine. And random hot tip, just like really quick optimization one. It's good to just have your geo resolution go down as you go up in your tree, just because the player is down on the ground where you have the roots in the bottom. So like up the top, you just really have like four-sided cylinders, super simple. So easy optimization trick there. And yeah, that's kind of the results. This was from like the Luscious map, from like that spiny forest, the general open world, that city map again, and those trees. That was like two parts of the same map. From that volcanic area to the snowy area. And yeah, so moving on to bushes. So I wanted to use a new creation method for them. Because there was a bunch of issues with the previous game's bushes. So I wanted to like leverage the modular approach, obviously, to like make a whole bunch of variants for all 5 open worlds, because they all had to be like relatively unique. I wanted to improve on the quality to make them look fuller visually, and then also they ended up being like really expensive in the last game, so they wanted to optimize that. And then also just leverage like the new instancing tech that we had in the Monolith engine. So yeah, and then also there was like new dithering tech that they wanted to leverage as well. And also we had like fire propagation in the game that got added for gameplay. So we needed to make sure that anything that got burnt looked good and didn't look like you could hide in them. So a bit of a before and after comparison. Oops. So that's with the bushes in the last game. The movement is like a bit stylized, really poppy. When you moved in, the camera would crush the leaves, you'd lose view of the player. So a lot of issues I kind of want to like get away from. And they just kind of built their bushes like this dome, essentially, and it was empty inside, and there was like all the leaves around it. So it was like, I don't know, just kind of a bit of a weird way to build it, but it worked at the time. And this is what we ended up with on Shadow of War. So the bushes are overall much fuller. When you're moving through them, it feels a bit more natural. And then when you pull the camera in, just dithers, so you can kind of still see the player and not impede on gameplay. So yeah, overall I was pretty happy with it. And then again here, it's like leveraging the modular approach. The leaves and the branches are separate. I'm not gonna go through all the steps again. But I basically just created like a reusable layout of leaves that I used across all 5 open worlds. So like the top left one, that was like used across like 2, even 3 maps almost. Where just like that snowy version was in that snow map. That second one, just with some tweaks to make the colors look more muted and more aggressive, and then also more ashy because it's the volcanic area. I did that, and then after for the bottom one, that's like the lush area, so things are more vibrant, more saturated, added some flowers in there for good measure. So it's just like little tweaks, but that make them feel a bit better per map. And then also you can kind of see there too, like for more variety, it's good to have the full life cycle of the leaves on your texture sheet, just from like green to like mid-range and dead. Just for more variety when you're building your cluster in the next step here, because you can kind of have different ratios of them. So again, same process here. You're taking that texture sheet, you're cutting it up, you're LODing it, and then you're assembling it into this cluster here. And it's like fairly cheap, like something like 700 tries. And honestly, that was the bush essentially, just that cluster. So you're basically taking that, and then we had like two prefabs, like a large and a small bush. And then I was just instancing that like 20, 30 times, and then just leveraging the instancing tech that we had. So like draw calls were not a problem here. And I just kept it to that one cluster. So it kind of made those bushes, and it was as simple as that, really. So yeah, in terms of poly count, like the previous bushes were something like 15, 20K, and this roughly matched that, not that it really mattered because of the instancing tech. But yeah, they look much fuller, even though they had the same res. So honestly, this was like kind of one of my biggest wins on the project in terms of like creating them really fast, and so where the modular approach like kind of really came useful. So like I just created like a fast variance of the bushes for all 5 open worlds. And as a nice surprise too, like the GPU performance ended up being 50% cheaper when I was profiling this on console, just because it was leveraging that new tech and it worked out really great. And then just because of how it's built as clusters, things look more natural when burnt and also when you're moving through it, so that was good. In terms of shadow performance, that was like the one con. It got expensive. So as an optimization, I had to like turn off shadows for later LODs and just keep it on for LOD 0. So that's where there's room for improvement, obviously. You can kind of simplify later LODs or just make your clusters half as cheap, and then you could probably keep shadows across the whole range. And then here, literally a hot tip. If you have fire propagation in your game, it's great to use gradients for your alpha to like kind of define where the burn direction will happen. So you kind of keep like your white core, and that's where like it'll burn down to. And then you can use Photoshop's threshold filter to actually just test that, how it would burn. And here's a quick example. So they wanted like burnt bushes to not look like you could stealth through them, because all the bushes are used for stealth and cover. So you'll kind of see it for this like one patch here on the left. And it's going to kind of burn down really quick. Like blink and you'll miss it, but that's just using the gradients. And then that way, when you're walking through it, it's not going to feel like you can cover in it. Well, you can't cover in it. So yeah, and that's kind of like examples of bushes from my portfolio, and like the dense forest, and that cavernous area, which is like just the exit of one, and that volcanic area I was mentioning. And yeah, now for ground foliage, ending with this. And honestly here, there's no modular approach really. Pretty standard Atlas creation here, just because like ground foliage is like mass propagated way more than like trees and bushes. So it doesn't really make sense to push as much poly count here, because I think that would just like probably tank performance on most engines. And here, a hot tip that we kind of like realized mid-production was that with our new instancing tech, there was like kind of like an upper limit of like how many types of vegetation you could have. So I think that's something like 30. But then like your texture sheet would actually contribute to that vegetation type limit. So like for the first maps I split the vegetation per region, where like this one wilder area had one sheet and the city map had one sheet. But that turned out to be like kind of like a waste, because you're wasting a type on that. So that helps CPU performance. Might be the case for other engines, I'm not sure. And yeah, so for the ground foliage, it's pretty simple. I tried to map most elements to a single triangle, as you'll kind of see in the video. And that way you can kind of just have more density when you kind of map it to a single triangle. Just because imagine if you're using a quad, you have like double the thing, and it's like twice as expensive. So here, yeah, just 25 tries. You can like LOD it down just by removing the single triangles. And in terms of like diameter, we kept it to like 1 meter roughly, just because like if you're like walking on it and crushing it, like any bigger than like 2-3 meters, it kind of looks goofy. So that was kind of the happy medium we found. And another thing that I kind of took for granted on the Far Cry engine was mesh normals, because like the engine would actually just do it for us, I realized. Because when I threw in grass for the first time on the Monolith engine, the self-AO was really bad, it looked really ugly, and I was like, what the hell? And then I was looking at it with the programmers, and yeah, they were just like, have you checked your mesh normals? I was like, oh, no. So yeah, you just have to like point them up, like not fully up, or else they're not gonna get any shading, but just like kind of like this. So it's just something to keep in mind if your engine doesn't do it. And then hot tip number 1 for this, it's good to taper the scale of your grass as you get to the edges. You can kind of see it there roughly, where it kind of makes like a bit of a triangle. So that way, that's for like when you have like your grass coming up on like the edge of a path or whatnot where it's terminating, like you'll kind of get a nice gradient. It's not gonna just be like a wall of grass, so it blends nicer. And then in the spirit of blending again for number 2, if you're blending like a green and yellow grass, it's good to like have a bit of each in the texture and the model. So like if you have a green grass, have a bit of yellow in there, and they'll blend better when you're mixing them both together. And so for propagation, we end up using a mass propagation system for on the height map terrain essentially. So the tech artist would do like an initial pass in World Machine to propagate everything. And then I'd kind of go in and like hand paint a lot and just like sculpt the terrain so it spawns better. And like, cause the maps were big, but like not that big that you couldn't do that. So that was like okay to do. And then from there, I'd kind of take that painted layer of grass, which I was just painting like the terrain texture. And I'd bring that into Substance Designer. That's where I kind of use this lightly here, just super basic functions. where I was just using noise masks to break up the spawning and just kind of make things feel more natural. Layer on AO so it doesn't spawn inside tree trunks and things like that. And then for trees and gameplay bushes, those were all hand placed just because level design needed like control over that. So initially they would do a pass on placement, and then after I'd go behind them and clean it up. So yeah. For room for improvement, obviously if you're making like a bigger open world, you could definitely leverage Houdini to like get you like 80% of the way there, and then you can just focus on the last 20%. So for the last step, tuning. If you happen to have like a dedicated texture artist on your team, we found that it's great to have them do a first pass on your underlying terrain texture that you'd spawn your grass on. So here you can kind of see an example from like Josh Lynch's portfolio who I worked with. So this was like particularly successful on the one map that we worked on together. So he kind of like did a first pass on his texture, threw it in the engine. I saw that and I was like, okay, I'm gonna build my cards on top of that. And then I just used the same kind of colors and values that he had in his texture. And then I had to add like bushes and plants and stuff like that on top of that. So I did that, threw it in, he saw that, and he was like, okay, cool. He adds like those same color notes and stuff in his texture. So like that way it kind of just like blends together really nicely and harmoniously. So that's like a good way to work with your texture artist if you have one. So where there's room for improvement there, it's definitely beneficial to like, combine your texture artist with your vegetation artist and potentially another environment artist like who's doing rocks or whatever. That way you can have like the same moss that's being used for the terrain, for the tree bark, and for the rocks. So it's all consistent and like across biomes. So that's kind of examples from like that map I worked on with Josh. Things blend really well between the grass and the terrain, kind of like not a big difference between the bottom and the top. So yeah, that was like really successful, and like, we pumped it out like really quick too. It's one of the last maps we worked on. So yeah, and then just kind of like asset breakdowns from the different maps. So yeah, it's kind of like the stats. It was kind of funny compiling all of this. In terms of like all the unique foliage I created, that's like pretty much it for each map. Tried to reuse as much as possible, but yeah, ended up kind of pumping out all of this in like the 12 months, which is kind of crazy to look back on. In terms of key takeaways, kind of looking back on all of this, these are kind of the 4 I can think of when I was like looking back on my time. So number 1, reuse is your friend. 2, be proactive when you're working on vegetation. 3, work in passes, which is kind of a given, but always good to say. And then number 4, the speed tree look is totally avoidable. And I'll break each of these down. So reuse is your friend. Honestly, I couldn't have like done all this vegetation if I wasn't kind of using this modular mindset and approach for things. Because I kind of thought about it like, just starting with the trees, which translated to the bushes, to the ivy. Kind of thought about it from like macro to micro, really. Like I was reusing trees and bushes across maps, reusing the bark across multiple trees and multiple variants, and then reusing that same cluster along the same tree and across a different variants as well. So you just kind of take that mindset and you like push it to the extreme in that sense. Because like, in this case, it wouldn't have been like particularly efficient to like sculpt every bark uniquely, like or just like every tree, like the whole trunk. So just sticking to towable textures and reusing as much as possible. And like here, a quick example of like the pine trees. I just made the top one first for another map, and then I had to make the snowy version for the snow map. So didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Threw snow on there, made the leaves a bit more heavy, and call it done. So number 2, be proactive. So given that you're like a smaller team, typically one person or even just a couple of people, you're a small team, but your work has a huge effect on the game in terms of GPU and CPU performance. So it's super important to like kind of keep on top of it. This is kind of like an Excel sheet that I kind of had going for the whole project for like just the cost of vegetation as I was working on it. So I'd kind of often do like pre-optimization passes, post-optimization passes just to see how much I got back. And yeah, that's super important because like have like one story that I can think of where one day I just came into work and then suddenly all the vegetation was like twice as expensive, and I was like, what the hell? Like, what the fuck happened? And then I was chasing it down with the programmer, then turns out like some other unrelated change in the engine like caused that. But like had I not had my stats and data to back that up, like we would have been fucked with sitting with that, not sure what to do. So that was a good catch. So yeah, work closely with tech art and programmers on that end for debugging, keeping your rendering features for Veg like up to date and all that. And in that same vein as well, for the hot tip, it's good to like not have one master material for all your vegetation, just because it's good to separate it by shader type for like leaves, trunks, grass, bushes, because that way when you're profiling on console, it's typically broken down by shaders, so you can kind of see exactly where your cost is coming from. So 3, work in passes. So this is pretty much a given for most environment artwork, but it's kind of a pretty important vegetation just as you're building up the rest of the world to kind of go along with it. So like, and especially in speed tree as well. So your first pass, you're just working on your initial pass of your models and textures, and you're keeping things pretty loose in speed tree at that point. You're keeping things procedural still, just because you want to create variants like really quick. So you can kind of see the example there for like that same eucalyptus tree. That's still using the default speed tree textures and stuff, but it's in your second pass, that's where you swap out everything essentially. Your own textures, your own models, your own bark. So, and that's where you hand tune a lot as well. So, and that's where you're refining each of the variants, worrying about your unique silhouettes as you turn the tree, the overdraw, all that, tweaking curves on the tree. And that's like the second pass there, which actually I was like really unhappy with. And that's kind of like a reason too that to work in passes, because like maybe you pumped out work that you weren't happy with and you like have a chance to go back to it and like apply what you've learned for later trees or vegetation after. And this was a good case of that. So there was a pretty big difference between the second and third pass here. And then for the third pass, it's just more minor things, more performance refinements, more micro detail polish. So like a lot of the profiling kind of feeds into this. And then also you just like, make your normals pop more with lighting, and as that's getting finalized, fix up your SSS and things like that. And yeah, and number 4, the speed tree look is totally avoidable. So like I think speed tree and like world machine typically kind of gets flack for like, oh, that's a world machine mountain and that's speed tree. And like sure, if you stick to like defaults, that's what's gonna give you. But like the power comes from like that you can customize everything and like really push things. So like at the end of a tree, this life cycle in a game, I guess, like you hand tune a lot by the end. So like those curvy trees, that was literally all in speed tree. I didn't even end up using like a custom model for the bark. It was just kind of curves that I curved up in the tree and use branches in creative ways to like just bend them down, things like that. And then also there's like lots of benefits for LEDs and optimization for speed tree down the line. And that'll save your life a lot when you have to like optimize, or if you're profiling, or if a program tells you like you need to cut down the veg cost by a lot. So you can do that really fast. So again, you just keep things procedural in the beginning, you generate your variants, and then gradually whittle down from there. Kind of same principle as in environment art, from big to small. So yeah, we're at the end, finally. And yeah, that's kind of like the swath of work when I had like left Monolith, sent that out. So like, yeah, really proud to have pumped out that volume of work in that short amount of time, minus kind of like a dedicated team that I would have had like at a bigger studio or whatnot. So like honestly, like I'm not kidding myself, like the work I did wasn't like groundbreaking or like changed the bar visually or anything, but like I take pride in the fact that I executed on it competently and made the best of like just being alone. So yeah, and as you can imagine, like that was like 2 projects in a row of working on vegetation. So like I was kind of looking for new challenges at that point and like wanted to get out of that niche. So that's what brought me to Respawn. Yeah, pretty much when I joined them, I was basically said like, yeah, I'm kind of done with vegetation. So like, and they were like, cool. And then they ended up doing a total 180. And I've just been doing a lot of hard surface work actually for the last 2 years. I've barely touched vegetation. And some of my shots will be coming up in a little bit.
Trust no one.
So yeah, worked on a lot of the ship that's going to be shown here. Massive Star Destroyer.
The galaxy's changed.
Yeah, look out!
Don't reach within. Don't stand out. Accept the past.
Execute Order 66.
Trust no one. Trust only in the Force.
So yeah, pretty big departure from Vegetation for the last 2 years. So just quick note about Monolith, they're hiring if you're interested in them. We're hiring a bunch on Respawn 2 across all 3 of our projects, on Apex Legends, Star Wars, and our super secret VR project. So check it out if you're interested. In terms of links, there's, yeah, my slides will be up there in that link. I have like the Photoshop dilation script I mentioned, that GDC talk from Far Cry, that BARC workflow that I mentioned from Steven Overman, and also just a random like IV growth script I use. So yeah, and questions, if I don't answer your question here, feel free to hit me up. Pretty much everyone's under social media, so that's it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, any questions? Come to the stage, please.
Can't have been that clear. I was probably speaking too fast.
Yeah, hi. You have been working with day and night scenes, or maybe I should say low and highlight.
Yeah.
And do you have any tips, or are there some changes to the process if you are working with the low light scenes for the foliage?
Honestly, not really, because like ever since the switch to kind of PBR, like that's kind of the whole point of it. So like as long as you keep your diffusers calibrated and like in range, it should work in both daytime and nighttime. So I was always kind of just checking against that. So as long as that was fine, it should be good.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I've got a question. You briefly talked about the mask that you created for spawning the vegetation and foliage. Could you elaborate or talk briefly about the rules behind it? Because with vegetation, there are some, well, if you will look at the nature, there are some rules about the trees and what will be underneath. Could you elaborate a bit about that?
Yeah, honestly, so like our mass propagation system, like you could kind of define like a spawn range for something. So like you could kind of have like a radius that something spawns in. So it's multiple radiuses of like different bushes and stuff like that. So you kind of like define it like that. It wasn't particularly like crazy precise in terms of like nature. That kind of went by eye a lot. But yeah, we just defined it by that. Basically like a spawn radius, and then after it would just base it based on that mask. Yeah.
Questions? Any other? If not, thank you very much once again, Jobye-Kyle Karmaker.